everyone. I'm Professor Raquel Ortega-Giles, and together with Caroline Yoromashvili, sorry for the surname, Caroline, we have put together a series of external seminars for City-REDI, and today we have the pleasure to have Cornelia Lawson. She is a senior lecturer in Science, Technology and Innovation Policy at Alliance Manchester Business School and a member of the Manchester Institute of Innovation Research. Before joining Manchester in 2019, Cornelia was also a lecturer at the University of Bath School of Management, and before was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Tokyo. Sounds very nice. She holds a PhD in economics from City, University of London, and held postdoctoral positions in Turin and Cambridge. Her research investigates the performance and career paths of researchers and inventors. At present, she is working on projects that look at open innovation in science, gender biases in science, and research funding decision-making. Today, Cornelia is going to present a paper that is titled "Satisfy or Money Back? Should Policy Keep Educating PhD Holders Despite Market Frictions?" So Cornelia, the floor is yours. So as I say before, and we normally do around 35 minutes, 40 of presentation. So you give some floor for discussion afterwards. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Raquel. I'm very, very happy to be here. Especially as I was saying before we started, I was hoping to present this paper in Milan at GeoInov a couple of weeks ago, but the conference was, of course, rescheduled because of COVID. So I'm really happy that I get an opportunity to present it today. I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. So you should be able to see this now.
Yes.
All right. Thank you. So, so the title is, yes, it is about PhD holders. It is about the careers and the satisfaction with the careers of PhD holders, and the kind of question, are we educating too many, given that a lot of PhDs do not enter academia, or are we, you know, is it right? Are we actually happy that we are sending a lot of PhDs into other markets as well? So that's where the kind of market frictions ideas comes from, though we are currently thinking about framing the title, because it's it's kind of moving gradually away from this a little bit as well. So this is joint work with Cindy Lopez-Bento from the KU Leuven, and I'll say a little bit more about Cindy's role later on, because she was very instrumental in getting this data for this paper. So where do we come from here? Now, this is a very old graph already, 10 years ago, but it's really nicely, it illustrates that a lot of PhDs do not end up in academia, and that's the case in many different countries. So this is from an OECD report that was published some time ago, but it really indicates that the orange at the bottom is education, that in some countries, a rather low percentage of graduates actually end up working in academia or education-related sectors, but that in many countries, PhDs, after the completion of their PhD, go into the private sector or the public sector, into other areas of public life. And this is something, I guess, that has sometimes been said as one of the goals of educating PhDs, to get knowledge from academia into other sectors. But it's also been criticized under the question of, are we educating too many PhDs? Do we even need that many? Are we spending too much money on educating them and flooding the market? Now, the reason why there is this contention is that generally PhDs have the goal of becoming an academic researcher. And in fact, for many PhD programs, we kind of expect our PhD students to have that ambition. And in surveys, continuously, an academic career is ranked as the first preference. And this is very much linked to some more innate characteristics, such as what in the economics of science has been called a taste for science, taste for research freedom, academic interactions, upstream research, and so on, which academic researchers share, and which is also shared by PhD researchers. But we also know, as I've just shown from the previous graph, that these preferences are not met. And here is where those market frictions come in, because this may lead to dissatisfaction if a lot of PhDs end up in jobs that they do not enjoy and that they do not actually want. And as we know from the labor market economics literature, if you are dissatisfied, that leads to negative labor market outcomes, including diminished productivity, high turnover rates, and absenteeism. So you can see that I'm already mentioning 2 lines of literature here, the economics of science and the labor market economics literature. I'm also, in this paper, we're also including thoughts on the importance of different intrinsic and extrinsic rewards for satisfaction, building on the psychology literature, especially self-determination theory. And this is very much kind of coming out of the idea that not all, that satisfaction is not just one thing. You can be satisfied in your job, but of course you might be satisfied with different elements of that job to different degrees. And the idea that those different degrees could balance out, that you might trade certain job elements for other elements. For instance, you might sacrifice some of your research freedom in exchange for a higher salary. And while this is kind of a very economic idea behind that, in psychology literature, it's really more about understanding where those intrinsic motivations come from and how they're related to rewards, and also the idea that some of those motivations are so intrinsic they cannot easily be traded away. Now, when it comes to our specific research questions, well, based on combining those 3 literatures, looking at the economics of science, labor market, and self-determination theory, we do want to challenge some of the previous finding that say those with a strong taste for science, those with a strong academic motivation will go into academia, by showing that this is not necessarily where they are finding themselves to be more satisfied. So we want to question that academia really is the most attractive destination for PhD holders, which is something that a lot of the economics of science literature has generally implied. You know, there's this preference, so surely if there's a preference, that's also where you ideally would want to end up. So we challenge this, firstly. We also want to complement previous findings by including the public sector more centrally into the discussion. A lot of the literature that comes from looking at STEM or looking at the US has generally ignored the public sector. But of course, there is a lot of research on the importance of the public sector, and I'll come to that later. But also in Europe, it is a very, very important destination for PhDs. And finally, we extend previous findings as well by considering not just PhD holders, but also PhD dropouts, because in a way, we're only really able to understand if there are certain opportunity costs for PhDs in doing a PhD despite dropping out of academia, if we actually compare them to those that did not complete a PhD. So let me expand a little bit on those 3 elements. So the first one is the idea of satisfaction in academia. And I've already mentioned this, that we start with this premise that there's a preference for an academic career amongst PhD students, but and that it's very important to have a match with your preference for job satisfaction. So this is what I started out on. However, those preferences are not always met. Firstly, because there just aren't enough academic positions, but also because maybe an academic career isn't even that attractive. It's very competitive. There's a lot of pressure. It might be very difficult to combine it with, for instance, your personal life, especially if you're forced to move because a job might not be where you currently are placed. So there might be lots of things that dissuade PhDs from pursuing an academic career while they're doing their training. Also, a lot of non-academic employers do offer attractive packages and attractive positions, whether that is giving the opportunity for publishing, opportunities to network with academia still. You know, you get many companies that also go to conferences, or allow their employees or their researchers to go to conferences. So there are adjustments being made, which might mean that a private sector job could be very attractive, or even also a public sector job more so than an academic job. And PhD students might become aware of these benefits, especially if they do meet researchers at conferences from such other employers. And finally, what I've already also alluded to is that there are, in a sense, people are not just motivated by, you know, this idea, I want to have research freedom, I have a taste for science, but of course they also want to have a certain quality of life. And those different types of motivations might compete, and in fact then decide where people end up. So our first proposition is that those that are employed in academia are not necessarily more satisfied than those employed outside academia, despite a higher preference at the outset. Now, as a second stage of, again, this kind of second contribution around public sector and employment satisfaction, and here we kind of bring in a lot of this public sector literature that generally finds that workers, regardless of education level, are more satisfied in the public sector compared to other sectors. This is partially because of certain job security it gives people, but also this feeling of contributing to public service. So it's kind of public service motivation that's very strong and very intrinsically satisfying as well. But this has been largely ignored in the economics of science literature that's really been focused on the kind of academia versus industry dichotomy. So bringing this in, and especially building on this public service motivation literature, we propose that PhD graduates that are employed in the public sector, and by this I mean the non-academic public sector, express a higher satisfaction with intrinsic, that is, you know, something that's just self-motivating, such as serving the public, and also extrinsic rewards such as salary, security, and so on, compared to those employed in other sectors. Now, I'm not going into details about the psychology literature and so on, because I think that's going to get too long. And I'm just hoping that you'll come along. But an example of intrinsic is, in our case, research freedom, serving the public, and extrinsic rewards. Examples are job security, salary, and then in brackets here I write internalized extrinsic rewards. And these are things such as having a responsibility in your job or promotion. So they are not, they're in a way almost become part of your job, such as for us academics, moving up the career ladder, getting a publication published. That's considered an internalized extrinsic reward, because we have really made it part of what we think is our identity as an academic. Now, the third element that I mentioned at the start was, in order to really dig into whether there are opportunity costs to pursuing a PhD, especially given that we've now proposed that PhDs might be even more satisfied in a job that is outside academia, potentially didn't even require a PhD. There could be also a mismatch in the labor market where the education of the PhD is not actually being utilized. And this is a problem if you're underutilizing the education that has been received. It could be costly for public policy if this is not used, but it's also costly for the PhD themselves, who have a delayed or maybe badly prepared entry into the labor market, because many PhDs simply are not prepared for the labor market outside academia. Now, to understand these opportunity costs, we compare PhDs to those that abandoned the PhD training. And of course, there are many reasons to drop out of your PhD, and such as that your motivation throughout the PhD, you might realize that you don't have a motivation to do basic research. You might just actually be much more interested in development, and that might be something that you become aware of. You might not enjoy the work environment, as I said, about competition, funding requirements and so on, or it might just simply not suit your personal life in terms of potential requirements to move in the future for your job. So these reasons for dropout actually overlap very heavily with the reasons that people leave academia. And therefore, if these are the main reasons for leaving academia, or the main reasons for dropout, then maybe the dropouts did the right choice because they had recognized sooner that they should leave. And that would mean that continuing to the end would increase the opportunity costs. However, at the same time, if the dropout is not exclusively linked to those types of considerations, but it's really more linked to mismatch with supervisors and other kind of environmental issues. So you didn't really want to stop your PhD, but you felt forced out of your PhD. That could really give you a sense of failure, and that in effect then would mean that those dropouts would be less satisfied, would generally have they could also have fewer jobs available to them, especially maybe not the types of jobs that they were after when they first started the PhD training. And therefore, we would actually think that continuing to the end decreases your opportunity cost simply because, that your PhD was well earned, or that it was right to finish the PhD, because dropping out would have had a lot of negative consequences. In effect, our proposition 3 therefore is that PhD holders are not less satisfied because we've got these competing arguments, and we'll see where that leads us. Now, the reason we did propositions was that it was going to be very complex to write hypotheses around all of this, so we opted for propositions at this stage. So our setting for this study is a Luxembourgish PhD grant. Now, I don't think many of us know much about Luxembourg, so we can almost consider it an academic startup nation. Their university was only founded in 2003. It's relatively small academic structures, but highly international, because almost everybody had to be hired from abroad when the university was founded. But of course, it's also highly international in general as a country. It has a lot of international banks, which have people working, a very highly international workforce. But also the PhDs that receive those grants are not necessarily educated for the Luxembourgish market. More than half of the graduates of this PhD program, of this PhD grant, leave or work outside of Luxembourg. And this is not a problem for the Luxembourgish funding agency. They are more interested in really increasing the scientific capacity of Luxembourg, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they want everyone to stay in Luxembourg. So they're not unhappy with the outcome that they're training people for the world or for the outside as well. Now, my co-author Cindy, she is at KU Leuven, but she also is part-time employed at the agency. And this is how we got access to the data, because the agency hired her specifically for us to be able to look at that program and to understand how the program works, what happens to the people. So there's kind of an evaluation element to it. So we are getting complete freedom of what we do in terms of the research question we look at, and in terms of how we work with the data. So it's kind of a very nice setting of having full access, but no strings attached, which we're very grateful for, of course, but it's just something I would like to mention at this point. Now, so the sample that we look at is the population of applicants to this research grant, for this kind of individual PhD grant scheme, when PhD student applies with already a supervisor attached. So they've already secured a supervisor, they've written a proposal, and that's the point at which they apply. Some of these applicants are already in the first year of their PhD and seek funding for the continuation of the PhD. So there's starters and first year students that apply. And in total, over an 11-year period, that where we've got data, there is more than 1,800 applicants and a success rate of about 50%. So half of these people don't get money. It also contains detailed information that we get, such as nationality of these applicants, but also different things about the proposal, how it was ranked, etc. You are eligible to apply, firstly, if you're a Luxembourgish national or citizen, actually, if you have lived in Luxembourg for at least a minimum amount of time. And when you're applying as a Luxembourgish citizen, you can study anywhere in the world. So you can apply to come to the UK to do your PhD. Or you are a foreign citizen, but then you need to study in Luxembourg. Now, it might also be important to mention that at the start of the program, when Luxembourgish PhD programs were still very young and not very developed, a lot of supervisors or a lot of students had dual supervision. So they would have a Luxembourgish supervisor, but maybe a second supervisor in France. And they would actually get the PhD degree sometimes joint or sometimes only from the French university, because the structures in Luxembourg weren't there to fully support PhD training. So we actually get, even amongst the foreign citizens, quite a few who actually did a PhD only nominally in Luxembourg, let's say. Now we complemented all this data with information on just looking at career profiles for websites and so on. We also did a survey, and the survey is where we got really detailed information on PhD experience, their satisfaction, their employment histories. And we had a relatively high response rate for a web survey. And this is down to, again, Cindy, my co-author, sending up to 8 reminders to these people. We really did harass them quite a bit, I would say. But in total, we had 608 responses, or 630 then, plus some incomplete, 608 observations that we work with. We also complemented it with publication data, which of course mainly applies to those who actually did some PhD training and not the ones that did not. Now, different variables, most of them coming from the survey, often then cross-checked with other data that we could find around job satisfaction. Firstly, we ask 8 items, which are the ones that come from previous surveys, especially the US surveys on the careers of doctoral holders, to have some comparison there. Where we asked about their job satisfaction, but also then combined those into overall satisfaction, as well as those 3 measures that I've mentioned: intrinsic, extrinsic, internalized extrinsic. We asked about their PhD status, which we asked them whether they, firstly, of course, we know whether they got funding or not, but even amongst the funded, some of them dropped out. And then amongst the non-funded, some of them got funding from elsewhere. So they could also continue to do the PhD. So we do have some dropouts, but it doesn't mean that all the non-funded dropped out. That's not true. A lot of the ones that were not funded had other sources. But still, we have some who did not complete a PhD, about 17% of the sample, so 100 respondents. We also have some who are still in training at the time of the survey, and we use them as a comparison for some of the variables around preferences and motivations. Because of course, those that are finished with their studies and already in a job, it might be, you know, if we ask them about their preferences and motivation, they really remember, will they really tell us what their preferences and motivations are? And here's where those the students that are still in training, are a good comparator. We also ask about their research, their job content, and for the PhDs, we ask about whether it's closely related to their PhD or not. And for the people who did not have a PhD, we ask about whether it's a research-related job or not, to get some idea of if they're able to do a job that maybe is at least close to what their initial preference might have been. Now, this is just quickly some of the summary statistics that we have. And as you can see, we've got about 17% who on the sample who did not complete the PhD. Also 17% who are still in education, so they're a good comparator, as I said, for some of the motivation variables. We have 45% female. The age is at the time of the survey, so it looks a bit old because some of these people have completed their training already 7-8 years ago. You see that 30% are Luxembourgish nationals, 70% at least nominally did their PhD in Luxembourg. As I said, it doesn't necessarily mean that the complete training was there. For those that dropped out, this is the variable that measures where they would have wanted to do their training or where they started the training. And then we have different subject areas: life health, humanities, social sciences, and STEM. We also look at where they find a job, and here, because of course we have people from many different countries, we simply differentiate between finding a job in your home country where you're a national, a job in a country where you did the PhD, if it is different from the home country, or if it's a job in a third country that neither your education or your nationality is related to. And as you can see, we get good proportions in each of those. The number of observations is lower for those that have already got a job, because this is minus the ones that are still in education. Now, I'm going to have to hurry up a little bit, but I just wanted to show us a comparison of the preferences between PhDs and dropouts. And both of them rank an academic career very highly in their preferences, and there's no significant difference there. The dropouts have a slightly higher preference for all sectors, really, but the differences are overall very small between the two groups. And that's kind of our premise, that the dropouts are very similar to the completers. But when you look at job outcomes, of course, the dropouts are not able to secure academic jobs. They end up in the public sector quite a lot, though. So this also shows that the ones that did not get funding are in no way different from the ones that got the funding. So they really went on, differently funded, but still very similar path in terms of preferences as well as where they end up in their job. But the dropouts are completely different when it comes to the outcomes, to where they ended up working, much more in the public and private sector. Similarly, when we look at job motivations, there's very little difference between the PhDs and dropouts. So the dropouts are really motivated by the same elements as the PhDs. You see a slight significant difference there, that the PhDs are actually more extrinsically motivated than the dropouts, but it's a very minor difference that seems to be connected to job location. But the dropouts simply don't care anymore about job location. They're probably just desperate for a job. But when it comes to sectors, we do see quite a lot of significant differences in terms of what your motivation in your job is and where you would like to work. So this is just to show that we, in that sense, are in line with prior studies. In terms of our analysis, we do two things. Firstly, we look at a OLS regression, where we measure satisfaction as a function of job outcomes as well as your PhD status. We do, of course, need to consider that satisfaction is not independent from what motivates you. This is where our discussion of the psychology literature comes in, which talks about that you might find a job or that you might be satisfied with a job based on its fit with your motivation. So we then include job motivation as a mediator. And of course, the labor market literature tells us that you're satisfied because of a match with your education. So we include job content as another mediator to see how that affects our main variables. And then, of course, selection into your job is not exogenous. We make a choice when we select into a job or have different opportunities. So we also run a model that accounts for endogenous selection into those different sectors. And here, there's basically some latent factors that are included in this model, and I'm using the M-Trade-REG model by City-REDI. And the latent factors look at the unobserved effects that could explain your selection into different sectors. So first set of results about this is overall job satisfaction, and as expected, the PhDs are no less satisfied than the dropouts. In fact, the dropouts are a lot less satisfied. And we also find that those working in the public sector are more satisfied than those in the academic sector. So, and in fact, very strongly so, there's quite a strong effect. If we include our motivation variables, we can see that having kind of intrinsic motivation enters positively, has a positive impact on satisfaction, which kind of matches up well with the motivation fit literature from psychology, but it doesn't affect our main predictors. What does change something is including job content. So once we account for the job content, so whether it's a research-related job or PhD-related job, there is no difference in satisfaction between PhDs and dropouts. So in effect, the whole difference is explained by the fact that the dropouts are not able to get those research jobs. And I don't think that's particularly surprising, but it just kind of confirms that this is the main mechanism behind it, and there's not the motivation mechanism at play, but really a job content mechanism. I'm not presenting all the controls, because the only control variable that's actually significant is gender. Women are, on average, less satisfied in their job than men. And when I look at the results for the different types of satisfactions, then it's in particular intrinsic. Actually, it's everything. Yeah, women are generally less satisfied on most of those job factors. There is, I'm going to have to just quickly go over this, but we see that after accounting for job content, there is still a difference. So PhDs are still more satisfied with extrinsic rewards compared to non-PhDs. That really might be due to non-PhDs not being able to get those higher paid jobs. So this is even after accounting for job content, but public sector, why public sector employees are more satisfied is primarily explained by them having more extrinsic satisfaction. So job security might be a big one, and job and pay. So, and in fact, the most important thing is that academia does not mean you're more satisfied with intrinsic rewards, which we would normally assume. You get freedom, you have all kinds of good things for you, but it seems they're not more satisfied as a result of this in our sample. Now, the selection, this is the first stage of the selection model, just to see what decides selection into the different sectors. There are some interesting results here. Of course, we already know that PhDs are more likely to go into academic jobs. The dropouts seem to select more into the public sector, so that's kind of opportunities there. The outcomes are highly correlated with the preferences, and some of the control variables are also interesting. For instance, that you're more likely to get a public sector job if you are working in your home country. So public sector jobs seem to be out of reach for international workers, whereas private sector jobs, that's more international, it seems. And as an international PhD, you can work in the private sector elsewhere. So I think that might be the main one to point out here. We, of course, get some subject differences, which is not too surprising, with humanities and social sciences more likely to select into public sector, whereas STEM is more seen in the private sector. But actually correcting for this selectivity, our results do not change much. So if we look at a selection, the lambda, which tells us about selection, then is negative significant for the public sector, selection into the public sector, which means that on average, those that have a lower satisfaction are more likely to select into the public sector. So there are some unobserved factors there that explain both. However, the lambda for private sector is not significant, and our results overall do not change. So I've shown the model 2, which controls the motivations, but the bottom panel is the model that controls again for job content, and we see exactly what we've seen above, with the public sector still having higher extrinsic satisfaction, higher overall satisfaction, and the dropouts being insignificant. So the results are in fact unchanged despite having taken out some of that selection here, which makes us think that firstly, we might miss out on some of the selection issues there, of course, but also that it doesn't seem to play as big a role because we're already considering some important mediators. Now, to conclude, we hope that we've advanced our understanding in what drives or destroys job satisfaction amongst academically trained researchers. We had some premises, theoretical premises in our discussion that allow us to explain and to mitigate the concerns around dissatisfaction or job mismatch amongst the highly skilled. It really generally does not materialize. Both our theoretical discussion as well as our empirics showed PhDs are not less satisfied leaving academia. And importantly, it showed us that in line with general public management literature, public sector literature, the public sector is also important for the very highly skilled and not just for lower levels of education. And empirically, we're also able to show that even comparing with a group of similar of non-PhDs with similar preferences, we find that job satisfaction is still generally higher, but this is largely explained by job content. The dissatisfaction amongst dropouts might in fact be a problem since they've probably been interrupted in their planned path. There's certainly more research that can be done in this area. And we do find that there's some selection around achieving the kind of motivation reward fit. So that kind of fits nicely with the psychology literature, but we don't find overall strong selection effects in our model. Further, the higher satisfaction amongst PhD holders in general is quite reassuring because it does mean that we're not over investing in PhD training. If PhD graduates are satisfied, then there's going to be good spillovers, especially because most of these PhDs end up working in research-related jobs outside academia. And during that studies, of course, they are all contributing to science too. So their contribution is, you get double benefits almost. And to the question that we said at the start, do we educate the right amount? Well, in the end, that's a policy decision, but at least we're not training too many in terms of the job market outcomes. But one question that maybe remains is, we kind of had an emphasis on public sector, but can the public sector continue to absorb PhDs, especially in research jobs? And can they actually absorb international PhDs, which seems to be less the case at the moment, and they might well be missing out there by not opening up to more international PhDs. And that's it from you, and I think I've managed to just be on time as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, Cornelia. Fantastic. Well on time as well. So I'm now opening the floor for questions, suggestions, comments. So does any one of you have any comment to address to Cornelia? You can raise the hand. It will help. If not, you can just jump in. So I have Caroline. Caroline first.
Yeah, thanks, Cornelia. It was really interesting. So one thing I was wondering about, and I think you probably can't answer that with the data you have, but you might have an idea. So the dropouts, are they essentially, say, as happy as somebody would be with a master's degree or with a bachelor's degree? So I don't know if there's like, you can generally say there's this hierarchy that the more education you have, the happier you are, or the more satisfied you are. But would essentially dropouts fall back to this sort of master's level of satisfaction, or is there actually a penalty from dropping out that you're sort of, I don't know, unhappy with yourself in general, or I don't know where that might be coming from. But I think that could be interesting. A bit more into this penalty of dropping out, essentially.
Yeah, thanks for the question. No, we can't do it with this data. We can, of course, have a stronger discussion on this, comparing it to other studies. Generally, we do see satisfaction going up with education, but in terms of some areas of satisfaction, such as salary, there is an indication that it peaks at master level and goes down again. Where this group here might be a little bit different in that respect, because they are perhaps less driven by those rewards. They have, after all, initially thought they might want to pursue an academic career instead of going directly into a well-paid job. So there could be an untypical master's students in that respect, but it certainly deserves a bit more discussion. You're right. Thank you.
Thanks, Raquel, and thank you, Cornelia, for your presentation. I know this was in Luxembourg. In the UK, there's a lot more emphasis now and consideration to ease the flow of people, particularly, I suppose, with PhDs, but not only people with PhDs, between academia, the public sector, the private sector, and the third sector. You've highlighted here some of the issues about the public sector. Is that concern about people being able to sort of transition and move from one sector to another, is that apparent in Luxembourg, or is that in your opinion a UK issue?
Thank you, Anne. No, I agree. I'm sure I would say that this is a general issue. We, of course, don't exclusively have Luxembourgish, firstly, PhDs or people working in Luxembourg in the data, so it's a bit more broad. But I would say this is an issue more generally. We haven't looked at this in our data. We have questions for those that have already been working, or have already left, or have, graduated a few years ago, who might already have been in different jobs. We have asked them why they last switched jobs and so on. So that could be something to look into, just to understand if there were certain adjustment issues. I think it's certainly an area that requires more research, and there's certainly a lot of interest in this and how people adapt when they move into different sectors. And it could well explain differences within sectors. You know, some people being happy, others might be less so, depending on how well they are able to adjust quickly, or adjustments that are being made for them by their employer.
Yeah, thank you. I think it is an interesting point, and I think if you look at people who've moved from the public sector back into academia, I think that's hard. Mm-hmm. And I think it's also about how, you know, it's sometimes easier in practice to keep in one route and stay in that route than switch between, just because of, you know, how different it's not just pay, it's about how different what's expected at different grades. But very interesting. Thank you very much, Cornelia.
Yeah, thank you, and that's yeah, it's very relevant. Thank you.
Any more questions? Julianne?
Oh, hi, Cornelia. I'm very sorry that I cannot switch on my video at the moment, because I'm in the car, actually. I was just, thank you very much for this amazing, for the great talk, and congratulations to secure such an amazing set of data. You know, that's fantastic, really. I have one comment and one question. The comment was about the dissatisfaction of women. I was wondering, when you said that, is it, you know, the jobs they go into it, are they really comparable? You know, are they basically comparable to those, you know, to men and women, female and male, you know, applicants getting their job? Are they the same kind of jobs, but not the same kind of, you know, are they, you know, the same, you know, kind of, you know, income, flexibility, whatever they count for? That would be interesting to see if they're, for example, in a lower paid jobs, for example. That would be interesting. And the other thing I wanted to say, it's like, because I am often in a discussion where where I'm asked, is it worthwhile to do a PhD nowadays? And personally, having done one and having done the whole blood, sweat, and tear route of it, I was like, yes, I still think it's worthwhile. But for young people to see that, I think there's really a scope for good career advice, good career guidance, because we need to probably make clear to them, look, by all means, do a PhD. That might be the best time of your life, or maybe not, but be clear about it. Academia is not very likely your future, because I think the last number I saw was 2 or 3%, isn't it, of PhDs who go into academia actually, or who get a job there. So the likelihood of not going into is much higher than going into academia. But nevertheless, these are your options, and there are big options out there, as you clearly demonstrated. The civil service is one, and I think for STEM, for this is massive out there, also much more earning than in academia. So I think it is really also an issue of letting people know what they let themselves into and where they go out to, and this is really, and I think there's well, at least at my time, it was completely missing, and I'm not sure, how it's doing now. But thank you very much for an interesting talk.
Yeah, thank you, Yanni. Yeah, that's a very interesting thoughts. Thank you. In terms of women having perhaps not comparable jobs, that's absolutely likely. I mean, one thing we see is that they're less likely to go to the private sector, which of course perhaps is also a sector where the pay could be higher. But it could be something we could look into, because we did ask about job grade. We do have some more demographic variables, such as career breaks, children, and what activity of the partner, which I didn't use here. They're not really entering significantly into the models, but descriptively they could give us a lot of information around some of those mechanisms, and that could be something to pick up again to understand better what's going on there. So thank you for pointing me again in that direction. It's kind of, you lose sight when you've got so much data, especially of the questions that you had in the survey. Sometimes forget some of them. So thanks. And in terms of career guidance and so on, it's a massive topic for a lot of the education researchers now, who are really, and also the funders, including the Luxembourgish Research Council, who wants to encourage the University of Luxembourg to offer more career training and career advice to the PhDs and make it almost, I think in the newest programs, it's requirement of the PhD program to have that included. And just to say again about the amazing data, we're actually now working with the council to run an annual survey with the PhDs to understand how they're moving through the PhD and about the training and advice they're being given, because it is a big thing for policy and for funders. And I think it's the same here in the UK, at least judging from the discussions in the education research and also kind of reports by the UKRI and so on. It's something that is top of the agenda, but it's certainly not being it's not in universities, it's not arrived yet, let's say, in our training programs.
Mayra, do you have a question?
Yes, I'll try to be quick because I think we're running a lot of time. On that point on PhD experience, I think it's quite crucial, Cornelia, just drawing a little bit on what Julian said, because I remember that at one or many points in my PhD, I thought about leaving, about quitting the program. And then once sort of by the end of the program, I thought about, okay, maybe academia is not for me. It seems like I'm too stupid to be in academia. So maybe, the private sector will be the better option for me. So I think that looking into that is something worth exploring. Anyways, thank you. I find the presentation quite interesting. And as you were developing all of your points, I kept wondering about what your definition of cost of opportunity here. And one of the reasons why you kept sort of creeping in the back of my head was because if we're seeing satisfaction as cost of opportunity, I think that exploring gender here is definitely an interesting study to see to see why, because I think there is no comparability when it comes to women. Definitely the cost of opportunity for women when we decide to go into a PhD is way much more than for men. And definitely as women, I think we are way much more driven by intrinsic rewards than extrinsic, because we're not even compensated economically for all the things that we have sort of sacrificed in one word. So I think it would be good to see what sort of data you have there, and that you can see what controls you have, because also if we look at country as a control variable, this can also help explain, you know, all these differences. Some women in some countries are better treated, and even in academia, than in other countries, right? Let me see, what else do I have? And also, you got me thinking as a personal experience, and this is why opportunity cost as a concept is still there in my head. If I compare myself to a colleague who dropped out the program, I'm sort of assuming that this person wanted to be an academic, and that's why they were not a researcher, and that's why they enter a PhD, but for whatever reason, they left the PhD. So I'm assuming that we were sort of in the same path and that we're compatible at some point. But if you compare my career stage, my age, my employment conditions, etc., with someone who doesn't have a PhD, but we basically have the same conditions in terms of other variables, maybe the cost of opportunity for me is definitely higher. People maybe without a PhD, but who have another career in another sector may definitely be doing way much better. And these are just broad ideas that I have in my head. Thank you so much, Cornelia. Thank you, Myra. That's some interesting food for thought. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the whole idea was exactly coming from this, that if you delay the exit, you know, could you already be in your career where that person is who left it in the first year? And a lot of people leave the PhD training, so it's a very large percentage of students who don't complete it. So it's a very relevant question to look at this comparison. And obviously people leave for different reasons, and how they fare later on depends on the reasons for leaving. If it's more about I figured out research is not for me, then they're probably very satisfied and going into a different career. But if it is about, my supervisor wasn't very nice to me, I felt the environment was, so they feel like pushed out of their research, they felt like they weren't given the opportunity to do what they wanted to do, they're probably a lot less satisfied, and they might then look to you and think, you know, why was she so lucky to get a supervisor or an environment that enabled her to do what I wanted to do too. So yeah, but it could play both ways, and I think that's very interesting, that obviously it could be very different, as you say, for different categories of people. The data might get too small to look at all those different mechanisms, but it's certainly an interesting one to think about in our discussion. So yeah, thank you.
Sandra, do you have any questions?
Hi, an observation. I'm a third-year PhD student and a very mature, old person doing this. I was flabbergasted when I asked at Manchester where previous PhDs had gone on to work, and that there wasn't an exit survey, and that data didn't exist. And I think, you know, we've seen McGill and I believe Harvard have now started to do those exit surveys. And if you're going to give 4 years of your life, and that's also, I think, an ethical question when you get 3 years funding for a 4-year program, you know, there's something that nobody's ever completed in 3 years, but there's only 3 years funding to do it. I think the pressure and the opportunity costs are enormous without any accountability as to what are people doing at the end of it. And I think institutions really need to be pushed. I think funders of research need to demand that institutions provide what happened to your graduates. What did they do? Having come from industry, from the private sector, having been a consultant to government, navigating bridges between private sector and government for the last 25 years, that was my consulting. I find the isolation, the continued isolation, this silo, unacceptable today. I think if 93% of people are not going into academia, why are we training for very traditional academic careers? So I can say my entire career, I've never worked in such an isolated setting, and that's not how innovation happens. It's not how good ideas get developed. So I just don't understand why these training programs aren't evolving to be bridge builders, to provide facilitation training for more participatory, engaged, intersectoral, impactful research. So there you go, said my point. Great work, Cornelia. I think it's a really good start for a good conversation that desperately needs to happen. But I've been told I need to get a PhD before I can be over.
You're already contributing to a lot of discussion, Sandra, so don't worry about that. But yes, I mean, for the funders, it is certainly a concern. So again, the Luxembourgish research funder, they now want this exit survey, and they have, again, Cindy is helping them to set up this survey. So potentially we'll be able to observe that a lot better. I know that UKRI is concerned about not knowing enough. They do these occasional surveys, but they're not particularly good. And they're only, I think, one point in time after 3 years or so, and very low response rates because there isn't that link up with the institutions. So probably would be a much better place to do those surveys. But the UK data on PhD graduates is particularly bad, actually.
Well, thank you very much, Cornelia. I think it was a very, very interesting presentation. Please, any of you that want to continue the conversation, do not have any doubts to email Cornelia and continue from there. As you know, a blog is going to be published very soon with a summary of this presentation and the video for the ones that they want to have a look again at the presentation of Cornelia. And just to say that next week, on Wednesday at 1 o'clock, we will have Paula Prenzel presenting. And just to say thank you very much again to Cornelia, and thank you very much to everyone who has asked a question or has contributed to the discussion, and also to listen today this seminar. Thank you all, and have a good afternoon. Bye.